During this next lesson, I'm going to share with you the data flow diagram technique as it is explained in the BABOK guide. My name is Esther Lessing and I'm from Business Analysis Excellence. I hope you enjoy the lesson and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot more about data flow diagrams. And if you are preparing for one of the exams, the ECBA, the CCBA or the CBAP, keep in mind that this is a really important technique for you to fully understand. So pay good attention to the diagrams and exactly what they are used for. Enjoy the video. Welcome to the lesson on data flow diagrams. Let's get started. Right, so during this lesson, I'm going to discuss two different types of data flow diagram notations with you. And we are specifically going to be looking at data flow diagrams at the context level only. So let's get started. First of all, what is a data flow diagram? Well, it's a bit like what its name is implying. It is like a traffic map for information. So essentially, it shows where data comes from, where it goes, and how it's processed. Just like a traffic map shows the routes that cars would take from one place to another. So it's used to visualize how data moves through a system or a process. So before we look at a specific data flow diagram, I also just want to point out that you would have learned about process flow diagrams recently. So processes are focusing on the activities and the sequence of those activities, where data flow diagrams also show what is being done to the data, but the focus is very much on where data is coming from and what data is flowing to which parts of the system. So let's now have a look at an example. So we'll start with the context diagram with the Gaines-Salson notation. Now, this is a very old technique, but it's still very, very relevant and it's still used a lot today. So it's also a very simplified way of looking at data at a high level. And it's very valuable, especially when you start looking at interface analysis and you're starting your data analysis around interfaces to try and understand where does information come from and where do we send it. So as you can see, to draw a diagram like this, you will first start by identifying all the different external agents. And as you can see, the BABOK is here suggesting that you use a noun to describe these external agents. Then you will have your system or your data process. So this would typically be an active activity, so you'll use a verb or potentially a noun depending on the situation. However, essentially what's happening in the middle here is the data that comes in is somehow being processed and transformed, and then it's being sent back out to a different system. So in the real world, you would often find that an external agent is in fact a different system. Now, this could be a system that is completely outside of the organization and is sending information to the system within your organization, or it could just be another system within your organization infrastructure that is sending information to your system. So then basically what you do is, so once you've identified all the different external entities that's sending and receiving information from our data process, then you show this by describing the type of data that's flowing. Now let's have a look at a practical example of how you can apply this particular technique, just so that you can bring it to life a bit more. So let's imagine a grocery store system. So who could be all the different entities external to our system that will send us information or receive information from us? And in this case, you will see that we've actually identified the customer as being one of our sources of information, the employee that works at the grocery store, the suppliers that sends us products to sell, and then the bank. who handles all the money that comes in and out of our system. So in a simplified way, let's take an example of the customer. So what type of data or information do they send our system? So if you think about the real world, you might walk up to the grocery store teller or the person that will take your payment for your groceries, but they are effectively using a system. And when you hand over your bank card to pay for something, you're effectively sending their system payment information. They will then transform that payment information and send it to the bank. Similarly, once you've made your payment, your system, the grocery store system, will send data or information back to the customer in the form of a receipt. So as you can see, we can look at another example of the supplier. So the supplier possibly have a system of their own, and they basically send us inventory details. So they might be sending us a whole shipment of products, but with those products, you will receive a lot of details about the actual inventory that they've sent us on a piece of paper or an electronic system, ideally. And this information gets put into our system to say what the inventory is that we now have. And then depending on how our stock levels go as we do business, we might automatically be sending a purchase order to the supplier to say, hey, we need more products for this particular type of inventory item, and so forth. So as you can see, this is really just trying to identify all the different inputs and outputs at a net level for your system. Now, just as a matter of point here, naturally, you can have more than just 4 entities, and naturally, you can have multiple inputs coming from the same entity or external agent, and also going back into the entity. So there's multiple flows possible. But for simplicity's sake, we just used this simple one flow per entity. Now let's quickly also just cover the other notation that follows a very similar principle, but delves into a little bit more detail in the world of data flow diagrams. So this is considered a level 1 diagram Jordan notation. Just like the Gain-Sarsen, it comes a long way and has been around for a long time, but it is still a very useful way of showing data flow. So here you do in a similar way, you identify what's referred to as external agents. You might notice that I refer to this as entities. It's very similar concepts. So then you've also got your input flows and potentially output flows. But in their example, they show that this particular external agent is only giving us one input flow. But what they do is they actually break up their system into the first level of data flow processes. So it shows here what are the key data transformation processes that happens within the system. And you can potentially have a data store within your system that might be used to put data for storage or retrieve data to do processing. So as you can see here, you might store transformed data. So let's say you did some calculations based on a transaction. Those calculations might be stored as some data for later retrieval. And as you can see, we've got here an input into the system, into this particular process, and this external agent has got an input into this particular process within our system. So it just gives us a bit more detail as to what happens within our system at a high level, a level 1 level, but it just gives us, like I say, a bit more context of exactly what's happening to the data that's coming in and going out. So just for the purposes of this example, here we can look at another example. We can still look at the same example that we used for Gain-Sarsen, If we were to expand our data flow system, we've got now high-level flows of process a payment when the customer pays for their groceries, reconcile the payments, that's when it goes to the bank and the bank sends us information back. Inventory processes, we might be storing our stock levels in a database, and there is an interface with our supplier system. And again, paying the employee is another aspect of our system where data is transformed, and it is basically flowing information to and from the employee. So as you can see, this is a bit more detail. It gives us a bit more context. And personally, I quite like this because it helps to add information to the requirements, the data requirements information that we are trying to communicate as business analysts. So what's the benefit of using a data flow diagram? It is a great way to show scope of a system, specifically in terms of the data that will flow in and out. So interfaces, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you would have been involved if you've been a business analyst for a while, data interfaces is essential and is part of every single project that you will most likely ever work on. And whether you get directly involved with data interface analysis or not, it will be there, and it's information that you need to understand, even if it's just at a business level. And it's a very effective visual way to show what is the different interfaces, or what are the different interfaces with our system, what data are we expecting to flow into our system, and what data will we be sending to different systems. And it also creates a starting point for you to visually display that information or illustrate that information in your elaboration of your requirements. And then you can go and specify the details of each of those interfacing points. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this business analysis technique. If you want to learn more, please subscribe or like this video. You can also find me at baexcellence.com. Until next time, thank you.